That early morning in 1977, I had only one job: drive Elvis Presley from the studio to Graceland, like I always did. But something was different. He wasn't singing, wasn't joking, wasn't asking me to open the sunroof so he could feel the wind. He just placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "Drive slowly. Today I need someone to listen to me." And that's when Elvis Presley, the king, the myth, the man the world thought they knew, confessed something to me that never appeared in any book, article, or documentary. Something that didn't fit his public image, and that, if I had told it before, no one would have believed. Before I continue, if you like real stories, unexpected revelations, and memories that change everything we thought we knew about our idols, subscribe to the channel now. It helps tremendously to bring rare stories like this one. And I ask you, if you were in my place, would you have the courage to tell the world what Elvis told me that night? Answer here in the comments. I want to know. I just finished my shift and was heading to the parking lot, exhausted from a 12-hour day, when the crew manager came running after me, his face flushed and urgent. "He's asking for you," the manager said breathlessly. "Elvis wants to leave, and he'll only feel comfortable with you driving." My first instinct was to say no. I was bone-tired, my eyes were burning, and I'd been looking forward to getting home to my wife and a hot meal. But the truth is, when Elvis Presley calls for you personally, you don't say no. You don't even think about saying no. You just go. I walked back through the studio complex toward the private lot where Elvis's car was kept. It was late, probably close to 2 in the morning, and the usual buzz of activity that surrounded him during the day had died down to almost nothing. A few security guards lingered near the entrance, and one assistant was making phone calls, but otherwise the place felt eerily quiet. When I reached the parking area, I saw him immediately. Elvis was sitting alone in the back of his black Cadillac, not surrounded by his usual entourage, not chatting with band members or bodyguards. Just sitting there in complete silence, staring out the window at nothing. The overhead lights cast strange shadows across his face, making him look older than his 42 years. Something about the scene made my stomach tighten with unease. In all the months I'd been driving for him, I'd never seen Elvis choose to be alone. He was always surrounded by people, friends, musicians, staff members who orbited around him like planets around the sun. Elvis hated silence. He filled every room with laughter, music, stories, but tonight he sat in perfect stillness, and that stillness felt wrong. I approached the car and tapped lightly on the window. He turned his head slowly, and when our eyes met, I saw something I'd never seen before in his gaze. Not just tiredness, but something deeper, something that looked almost like resignation. He raised his hand in a weak wave, gesturing for me to get in. I slid into the driver's seat, adjusted the mirrors, and was about to turn on the radio. Elvis always wanted music playing, always, when his voice stopped me. "Don't turn it on," he said quietly from the back seat. "Not tonight. I want to hear my own thoughts for once." I froze with my hand on the dial. In all my time working for him, Elvis had never, not once, asked me to keep the radio off. Music was his oxygen. Silence made him uncomfortable, restless. This request felt significant in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. "Sure thing, Mr. Presley," I said, pulling my hand back. "Whatever you need." The tension in the car was palpable, thick enough to touch. It felt like the air before a thunderstorm, charged with something unnamed and approaching. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Elvis sitting with his hands folded in his lap, his head tilted back against the seat, eyes closed. He looked exhausted, but not the normal kind of exhaustion that comes from performing or recording. This was different, deeper, like he was tired of something fundamental, something that sleep couldn't fix. I wondered if something had happened with his health. There had been whispers among the staff for months about medications, about doctors coming and going, about cancelled appearances and sudden mood changes, but no one talked about it openly. You didn't question Elvis. You didn't pry into his private business. You just did your job. and stayed loyal. Still, I couldn't help but study him in the mirror, trying to understand what had changed. His face was pale, his movements slower than usual. But more than that, there was something in his expression, a kind of knowing, a kind of acceptance, that made the hair on my arms stand up. He must have sensed me watching because he opened his eyes and met my gaze in the rearview mirror. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, and in that silence, something passed between us, an understanding maybe, or a warning. Then he took a deep breath, the kind of breath you take when you're about to do something difficult, something you've been avoiding, and spoke. "Just drive," he said, his voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before. "Take the long way to Graceland. I need to talk, and I don't know who else to say this to." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Whatever he was about to tell me, I knew instinctively that it was going to change everything. That after tonight, I would carry something I couldn't unhear, something I couldn't share, something that would sit heavy in my chest for the rest of my life. I started the engine, and as we pulled out of the parking lot into the empty Memphis streets, Elvis leaned forward and placed his hand on my shoulder. The touch was gentle but firm, and it felt like a plea, a confession, and a goodbye all at once. "Drive slow," he said quietly. "Tonight, I need time." For the first few minutes, Elvis said nothing. He just sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the dark Memphis streets rolling past, his reflection ghostly in the glass. I could see his face in the rearview mirror, illuminated intermittently by passing streetlights, on, off, like a slow strobe revealing and hiding his expression. I kept driving, taking side roads I knew would add time to the journey, giving him the space he'd asked for. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt necessary, like he was gathering courage from somewhere deep inside, preparing to release something he'd been holding back for too long. Finally, he spoke. "You ever feel like something's about to change? Like really change, in a way you can't undo?" I glanced at him in the mirror. "Can't say I have, Mr. Presley. Not in any big way." He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. "People think I have everything," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "The mansion, the cars, the fame, the money, and I do. I have all of it. But what they don't know, what almost nobody knows, is what I carry inside, the weight of it." I wanted to say something, to offer some kind of comfort or understanding, but I sensed that what he needed right now wasn't responses. He needed a witness, someone who would just listen without judgment or interruption. "Can I ask you something?" he continued after a pause. "Do you believe in premonitions, in signs?" The question caught me off guard. "Not really, sir. I mean, I don't think about that stuff much." Elvis leaned forward slightly, his face appearing more clearly in the mirror now. His eyes were intense, searching. "Well, I do, and I've got one right now. It won't leave me alone." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The way he said it, with such conviction, such certainty, sent a chill down my spine. "For weeks now," he continued, "I've had this feeling, this sense that I'm saying goodbye to things even when I don't mean to. I'll be at Graceland, walking through the rooms, and I'll touch something, a chair, a photograph, a guitar, and think this might be the last time. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds crazy. It doesn't sound crazy," I said quietly. "It's not fear," he clarified, as if worried I'd misunderstand. "It's not like I'm afraid of dying. It's more like something bigger is calling, something I can't explain or control, and the more I try to push it away, to ignore it, the stronger it gets." He paused, and I heard him take a shaky breath. When he spoke again, his voice was even quieter, more vulnerable. "I haven't told my family. I can't. How do you tell the people you love that you feel like you're being pulled away from them? How do you say that without terrifying them?" "I don't know, sir," I admitted. "Exactly. You can't. So you carry it alone. You smile, you perform, you pretend everything's normal. But inside, you're screaming. Inside, you're already halfway to wherever you're going. The streetlights had thinned out now as we drove through a quieter part of town. The darkness felt heavier, more oppressive, matching the weight of his words. "But someone needs to know," Elvis said, his voice suddenly firmer, more resolved. "Someone outside my inner circle, someone who won't panic or try to fix it or make it into something it's not. Someone who can just hear it, hold it, remember it." He leaned back in the seat, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw that his eyes were closed again, his face tilted up toward the car's ceiling. "And today," he whispered, "that person is you." The responsibility of what he'd just placed on me hit like a physical weight. I was just a driver, just a guy who knew how to navigate Memphis streets and keep his mouth shut about what he heard in the car. But now I was being asked to carry something enormous, a confession, a premonition, a piece of Elvis Presley's soul that he couldn't share with anyone else. "I'm listening," I said, and I meant it. Whatever he needed to say, I would hear it, I would remember it, I would carry it for him. He opened his eyes and looked at me in the mirror, and for just a moment I saw gratitude flash across his face. "Good," he said softly, "because what I'm about to tell you, it's going to sound impossible. But I swear to you, it's the truth." Elvis shifted in his seat, and I could hear the leather creaking as he moved. He was gathering himself, preparing to share something he'd clearly been keeping locked away for a very long time. "When I was a kid," he began, his voice low and steady, "I used to have dreams, not regular dreams. I mean dreams about things that hadn't happened yet. I'd see something in my sleep, write it down sometimes, and then months or years later it would happen, exactly the way I dreamed it." I glanced at him in the mirror, trying to gauge if he was serious. His face showed no hint of joking, no trace of the performer's charm he usually carried. This was something else entirely. "I never told anyone," he continued. "Not my mama, not my friends, nobody, because I knew how it would sound. People would think I was crazy, or worse, they'd think I was trying to be something I wasn't. So I kept it to myself. I learned to ignore the dreams, to pretend they were just my imagination." He paused, and I could see him running his hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I'd seen him do before when he was genuinely troubled. "But lately," he said, his voice dropping even lower, "the dreams came back, and they're stronger than they've ever been." "What kind of dreams?" I asked, unable to stop myself. Elvis took a deep breath. "The most recent one. I'm walking through Graceland. Every room, every hallway, just like always. But something's wrong. I can see everything clearly. The furniture, the decorations, the people. But nobody sees me. I'm there, but I'm not there. Like I'm watching my own life from somewhere outside of it." The way he described it made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a dream. It was something darker, something that felt like a prophecy. "I'm observing my own absence," he said quietly. "That's the only way I can explain it. I'm there, but I've already left. Does that make any sense?" "I think so," I said, though honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted it to make sense. "And here's the thing," Elvis continued, leaning forward now, his voice gaining intensity. "I'm not afraid. That's what's so strange about it. I should be terrified, right? But I'm not. I feel peaceful, like whatever's coming, it's supposed to happen." I felt a chill run through me, the way he was talking, the acceptance in his voice. It was like listening to someone who'd already made peace with their own ending. "I don't think I'm going to die young," he said, as if reading my thoughts. "That's not what this is about. But I do think my life as Elvis Presley, the public Elvis, the king, the image everyone expects, that's ending soon. I can feel it." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean I can't do this anymore," he said, and there was pain in his voice now, raw and genuine. "The pressure of being Elvis Presley, the expectation that I'll always be perfect, always be on, always be the man everyone wants me to be. It's killing me. Not literally, but spiritually, I guess you'd say. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was almost a whisper. I've been writing letters to people close to me, trying to explain this exhaustion, this feeling that I'm done carrying the weight of who I'm supposed to be. I don't know if I'll ever send them, but I needed to put it into words. The car felt smaller now, the darkness outside pressing in. I kept driving, but my focus was split between the road and the man confessing his deepest fears in the back seat. But here's the strangest part, Elvis said, and now his voice carried something almost like wonder. I'm not scared of any of it. The dreams, the premonitions, the sense that something's ending, none of it frightens me. I feel ready. I feel free almost. He leaned back again, and in the mirror I saw him looking at me with an expression I'll never forget. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was clarity, resolution. So, if something happens to me, he said slowly, deliberately, making sure I understood the importance of what he was saying, I want you to remember something. I felt it before it came. I knew, and I wasn't afraid. The weight of those words settled over me like a blanket made of lead. He wasn't just sharing a feeling or a passing thought. He was giving me a message to carry, a testimony to remember. I'll remember, I promised him. I swear I will. Elvis nodded, satisfied. Then he closed his eyes and fell silent, as if speaking those words had drained the last of his energy. And I drove on through the dark Memphis night, carrying a secret I never asked for, but would never be able to forget. As we approached the outskirts of Graceland, I naturally began to slow down, preparing to turn into the long driveway that led up to the mansion. But before I could make the turn, Elvis's voice stopped me. Don't go in yet, he said. Keep driving, just a little further. I nodded and continued past the entrance, following his unspoken directions. We drove for another few minutes until we reached a stretch of road I recognized, a quiet area with a wide shoulder where Elvis sometimes asked me to pull over when he wanted to get some air, away from the eyes and demands of Graceland. Here, he said. Stop here. I pulled the car onto the shoulder and put it in park. Before I could ask if he needed anything, Elvis opened his door and stepped out into the cool night air. I watched in the rearview mirror as he stood beside the car, his hands in his pockets, looking up at the sky. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes. Then he spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the stillness. This is it, he said. This is the moment I needed. Today was the day I had to say all of this. I opened my own door and stepped out, feeling like he needed me to be present, not just as a driver, but as a witness to whatever he was processing. I stood a respectful distance away, giving him space, but letting him know I was there. Are you scared? I asked, the question coming out before I could stop myself. Elvis turned to look at me, and in the moonlight I could see his face clearly. He looked tired, so deeply tired, but also strangely at peace. No, he said simply. I'm not scared. I'm just tired. He turned back to face the empty road ahead, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more contemplative. I'm ready to disappear, he said. Not in the literal sense, not like dying or anything like that, but emotionally, spiritually, I'm ready to let go of being Elvis Presley. The image, the expectations, the constant performance, I'm ready for it to end. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just listened. You know what's funny? He continued, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. I think people will only really appreciate the man I was when I'm not here anymore. When I can't perform, can't give them what they want, can't be what they expect. That's when they'll finally see me as human. He pulled his hands out of his pockets and crossed his arms over his chest, as if trying to hold himself together. Part of me wants to just run, he admitted. Leave all of this behind. Fake my death or just disappear one day and start over somewhere as nobody. Just a regular guy who used to sing, living a quiet life where nobody knows my name or wants anything from me. The confession hung in the air between us, vulnerable and desperate. Then he turned to face me fully, and his expression became even more serious, more grave. He walked toward me slowly and placed his hand on my shoulder, the same gesture he'd made in the car, but heavier now, more weighted with meaning. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Something I've never said out loud to anyone, and something I might never say again. Can I trust you with it?" "Yes, sir," I said immediately. "Always." He took a deep breath, and I could see him steeling himself for what he was about to say. "I don't think I'm going to see the end of this year," he said quietly. "I don't know why I feel that way, and I can't explain it logically. But it's there, this certainty, and it won't leave me alone. Something tells me my time is running out." The words hit me like a physical blow. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, to assure him he had decades left, but something in his eyes stopped me. He wasn't looking for comfort or contradiction. He was simply stating what he believed to be true. "If I'm wrong," he said, his grip on my shoulder tightening slightly, "then great. I'll laugh about this conversation, and we'll pretend it never happened. But if I'm right—" He paused, searching my face. "Don't be shocked. Don't be surprised. Just remember that I knew, that I told you, that I was ready." I nodded slowly, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Elvis let his hand drop from my shoulder and walked back to the car. "Let's go home," he said quietly. We got back in the car, and as I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, the silence that filled the space between us was heavier than any words could have been. It was the silence of acceptance, of goodbye, of secrets that would never be fully understood. I pulled up to the gates of Graceland just as the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky. The mansion stood silent and imposing in the pre-dawn darkness, its white columns barely visible against the trees. Elvis sat in the back seat for a long moment, not moving, just staring at his home as if seeing it for the first time or perhaps the last time. I couldn't tell which. Finally, he opened the door and stepped out slowly. I got out as well, instinctively, feeling like this moment needed more than just a simple drop-off. This felt significant in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Elvis walked around to where I stood by the driver's door. He looked at me for a long moment, and in his eyes I saw something that made my chest tighten. Gratitude mixed with sorrow, relief mixed with resignation. It was the look of someone who'd finally been able to set down a burden he'd been carrying alone for too long. "Thank you," he said simply, "for listening, for not thinking I'm crazy, for just being here." "Any time, Mr. Presley," I managed to say, though my voice was rough with emotion. He extended his hand, and I shook it. His grip was firm, but his hand was cold, trembling slightly. When he let go, he placed that same hand briefly on my chest, right over my heart. "Remember," he said quietly, "if anything happens, you'll know I saw it coming." It wasn't an explicit goodbye, but it felt like one. It sounded like one. Everything about that moment carried the weight of finality. I watched as he walked through the gates and up the path toward the mansion, his figure growing smaller in the darkness until he disappeared through the front door. And I stood there for several more minutes, unable to move, feeling like I'd just witnessed something profound and terrible that I couldn't yet fully understand. The next day, I heard through the staff grapevine that Elvis had cancelled all his appointments. He'd spent most of the day alone in his room, which wasn't entirely unusual, but the timing felt significant. The timing felt like confirmation of everything he'd told me. I went about my regular duties, trying to push the conversation out of my mind, trying to convince myself it had just been the late-night ramblings of an exhausted man under too much pressure. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the world had tilted slightly off its axis and would never quite right itself again. 2 weeks later, on August 16th, 1977, I was at home when the phone rang. I answered it, and the voice on the other end, one of the Graceland staff members, was crying. "He's gone," she said. "Elvis is gone." The floor seemed to drop out from under me. I stood there holding the phone, unable to speak, unable to process what I was hearing. My mind immediately went back to that night, to his words. "I don't think I'm going to see the end of this year." He'd been right. He'd known. In the days and weeks that followed, as the world mourned and the media circus descended on Memphis, I felt a crushing guilt. Should I have told someone what he'd said? Should I have warned his family, his doctors, someone who could have helped? Could anything I said have changed the outcome? But even as those questions tormented me, I knew the answer. Elvis hadn't wanted me to save him or stop anything. He'd wanted someone to know, to bear witness, to carry the truth of what he'd felt in those final weeks. And keeping that secret, honoring that trust, was exactly what he'd needed from me. For years, decades actually, I replayed that conversation in my mind. Every word, every pause, every expression on his face. I analyzed it endlessly, trying to understand what had happened that night. Was it a genuine premonition? Had he somehow known his death was approaching? Or was it simply the desperate confession of an exhausted man who'd been crushed under the weight of his own legend? I never found an answer. I don't think there is one. What I do know is this. That night, Elvis Presley stopped being an icon to me and became simply a man. A tired, frightened, incredibly human man who just wanted someone to understand that he'd tried his best, that he'd carried more than anyone knew, and that when the end came, however it came, he'd been ready for it. I carried his secret for all these years because I felt I owed him that much. But now, finally, I'm telling it. Because maybe the world needs to know that even kings get tired, even legends feel the weight of their own myths. Even Elvis Presley was, in the end, just a man who needed someone to listen. And on that dark morning in 1977, I listened.